Mute. Hey everyone, welcome to the Self-Care Rockstar Show, where each week I invite experts from around the world to share stories and information that will help you begin and continue your self-care journey. My goal is to encourage each of you to become self-care rock stars and to not only fill your cup, but cause it to overflow. If you're interested in courses or programs I'm currently offering, go to findsally.com. I would love to work today. I am excited to welcome Misty Cogdill to the Rockstar stage.
Sally, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you know what? I have been so excited about you coming. I'm just really excited about learning more about the handwriting. So Misty has been studying handwriting since 2011. She works with business owners and network managers, entrepreneurs, speakers, and pretty much anybody who wants to increase their goals by using handwriting analysis. Unlike other coaches, she's able to reach your goals by analyzing your personality traits and blocks in your handwriting. Misty understands that life is a reflection of the questions you ask, and she's a student of Power of Questions. So she's going to talk to us a little bit about how handwriting can heal us and what it can do for our lives. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about your story and how did you get involved in all this?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for the introduction. Well, I have a long story. I feel like it was all divinely guided since birth. This is something I was supposed to do. My mom wanted to change her handwriting since before I was born. And I never really thought much of it. I didn't understand why she wanted to change it. I just, kind of let it go. And you know how life kind of gives you those little nuggets and you don't quite listen? Well, fast forward, I'm an only child and my mom was a single parent. So I got to know myself really, really well. And I ended up getting married at age 22. And as most women do, traditionally, you take on the man's last name. And so when I got married, I changed my last name. And it's not like I got married and then the next day I was a different person, because if that was the case, everybody would have figured this out centuries ago. But it takes a long time when you start signing a new last name. It takes a while for the neurological patterns in the brain to shift and to actually rewire. Within the course of 1 year of being married, I kind of sat back and was like, I'm different. What happened? Something happened. I'm experiencing life differently. I'm not the same person. When did this happen? It's like you just kind of self-observe one day and you kind of sit back and you're like, things aren't the way they used to be and how I've always known them to be. I went asking other people for like, hey, what happened? Like, did you change after marriage? I never quite put the pieces of the puzzle together while I was married. And if I would have, obviously things, who knows, but for 6 years, I was just left in the dark. I asked questions and people said, you just changed. That's just part of life. Everybody changes as you grow older. That's just the way it is. And I said, no, I'm not going to accept that answer. Something happened and I'm going to figure it out. And when I do, I'm going to tell everybody and their mother about it. And so when the divorce came 6 years later, I ended up getting my maiden name back. And we
lost your volume.
Oh,
there you go.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, within the course of 1 year, got my maiden name back and got my old personality back, and I was me again. And I was like, okay, what happened? How did I go from not being me to being me again? Long story short, ended up putting the pieces of the puzzle together that it was my signature. and that every letter of the alphabet has a pattern, energy, and lesson to it, and started really working with the different, doing my own testing, doing my own experiments, doing my own observation. Got into real estate for 8 years. And obviously in real estate, when people sign purchase agreements, you see their signature. So I got to work with several people for 8 years, and every single time someone would sign, I would give them, that started a whole nother conversation after the purchase agreement when I would talk about their signature. So it was a long journey, but one that, I've spent years understanding and observing, and I wanted to share it with as many people as possible, because this is something that happens with every woman when they get married and they start signing a new last name, and nobody talks about it. I went looking for answers and nobody had answers. And I'm like, how can something so common not be talked about or have books or have education? And this should be in every marriage counseling before you get married. Like, this should be the topic of discussion, and it never is. And so I've made it my mission to educate as many people as possible.
So now, are there other people that do this along with you, or is this something, because I've never heard of this. Are there organizations, or do you have like a mentor? Is there somebody who taught you how to do this?
So I went looking for answers, and there's other people that teach it, but they don't teach it in the way that I do. I'm the one that had the experience with my story, and then I started crafting pieces. So I kind of took a little bit from one person and from another person and from another person, and I kind of started putting all these pieces together to kind of craft what I have. So I guess you could say that what I have is, the way that I teach it is unique.
Wow, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So what are some things that we can do with our handwriting if we want to change our personality? if we need to change certain areas of our lives, is there like a hard and fast rule? Like, if I cross my T's or forget to cross my T's, I'm gonna, become rich?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of different tips and techniques, and I've spent years crafting analogies so that the analogy can explain the concept of what I'm teaching. Because I started sharing things with people and they're like, I don't get it. But as soon as I would put an analogy with it, then they're like, oh, I get it. I understand what you mean. So it's been a journey over several years in crafting concepts and ideas to be able to explain it all. But every letter of the alphabet has a pattern, energy, and lesson. And if you write it one way, you're going to access more of the egoic side of you or the human side of you. If you write it another way, you're going to access more of the spiritual side of you. And it just depends on which one you want to play out. But the ego kind of, there's a lot of egoic games. I've been able to see patterns of jealousy in handwriting. I've been able to see blocks and limits, procrastination, persistence. If somebody's very intellectual versus very heart expressed, there's a lot to handwriting. And when you're able to sit back and observe it, I've had people say, well, I change my handwriting all the time. And I said, well, our handwriting is connected to our emotions. So if I ask you to write a letter about your mom versus if I ask you to write a letter towards your neighbor down the street that you don't know, it might show up a little bit different based on the emotions that get triggered while you're writing, or when, what you're thinking and feeling when you're writing it. So I've seen difference of people's handwriting just by asking if they would write about one person versus another.
Does it matter if it's cursive or printed?
Yeah, it makes a big difference, and it depends on each individual. But I share a lot with people, for example, if they're in the military. Obviously, if you go into the military, people that sign up and have to be in the military are forced, and it's required to write in all capital letters. If somebody writes in all capital letters, it tends to build walls around the heart. And so it's kind of like keeping people at arm's length, saying you can come close, but you can only come so close, and I'm not going to let you get too close. I worked with a gentleman, and he didn't really have any conflict at all with his wife or with his 3-year-old son. He said things are good. I don't have any complaints at all. And after he got done with my program, from changing writing in all capital letters, he ended up expressing, he goes, my 3-year-old son was not a cuddly kid. And all of a sudden he became a cuddly kid. And I said, isn't that interesting? He's responding to your energy. So the vibration that he sent out was different. That's why his son responded and reacted to him the way that he did. And once he changed it, his son became almost like a different kid. And all of a sudden he wanted daddy and was this super cuddly kid. Then he said things with his wife were fine before. And he says, but boy, did they get good. He says, it's like they're newly in love all over again. And I said, it's the response to the energy. And sometimes it can take up to 3 months to shift the neurological patterns in the brain. So it's not something that happens overnight. It takes time.
Right. Now, what about these kids today that just don't handwrite? I mean, it's all on the computer. It's all just typing. They don't,
Yeah.
I don't even think there's some states, I think they're not even teaching cursive anymore.
Well, I always say, based on what I've learned and what I share with people, is the fact that they don't teach handwriting anymore. The way that they were teaching it was 80% limiting. So I sit back and I say, good, I don't want them to teach handwriting anymore, because the way they were teaching it was wrong. And if they don't teach it wrong, at least they won't be as blocked and limited as, maybe some people are if they continue to write like that. But then, when you're shifting your handwriting, you're shifting brain patterns, and this becomes something that people have to be strong and stable if they take my program, because if they're not, I won't allow them in my program, because I've had people that weren't stable that it didn't end up being a good situation. So it's really important to know and to understand that when you're shifting brain patterns, you're shifting the neurological patterns in the brain, which will cause buried emotions that are unsolved to come bubbling up to the surface, to be healed and to be transformed and to be worked through. So then as you shift that, then you start to work and clear that. It creates an opening, plus we bring your goals in, and then that creates a quantum leap forward.
Wow. Yeah, I have someone coming in. It's amazing the way the brain works, right? I have someone coming in a couple of weeks, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how our brain works. So I'm really excited about that too. But the going from your handwriting to your brain is just amazing. I love that. So could you maybe share a few stories about maybe people that you've helped, or people that you've who have changed their handwriting and then gone on to do something that they didn't think they could do? Do you have a couple, maybe share 1 or 2 stories of people you worked with and the transformations they've made from just changing their handwriting?
Yeah, absolutely. One gentleman, and this is on YouTube as well, Andrew, is a gentleman that I worked with last year, and he's somebody that studied all personal development, everything under the sun. He was very dedicated, very persistent, very hardworking, and he said that he just felt like he had a limit. He's like, no matter what I do, no matter what I try, no matter what happens, he just has a limit, and he couldn't get past his limit. He couldn't get through. And he heard me speak, and he's like, oh, well, let me check this out. And so he showed me a sample of his handwriting, and I was able to highlight exactly where all of his blocks and limits were. And I said, well, I'm not surprised based on what you're sharing. And he was a gentleman that was in the area of finance and trades. And he ended up taking my program, and within the course of 4 months, he was able to go from 8 million to 12 million. And I tell people I did not help him earn his 8 million up front. He did that all on his own. So obviously he's a very hard worker in his business, but he kept saying, he just kept hitting the number 10,000, 10,000, 10,000 when the other guys were like 50,000, 150,000, 100,000. They were all getting a lot different numbers than him. After taking my program and shifting everything, along with, clearing a bunch of past emotions, he was able to basically advance his career and advance his sales by 234%. So
Wow.
he's like, is this stuff magic? And I said, no, it's science. One of the interesting things is, and I talk a lot with the people that are in the program, is they end up having very vivid dreams. Their dream state becomes very vivid and very real while they're dreaming, and they don't quite understand. So we process a little bit on that too, because when you're shifting like that, it's a connection between the soul and the human that are taking place. So this is done at a very deep level. And I actually just spoke with a woman the other day who said that when she was working for AT&T, AT&T said that they had to have her handwriting analyzed all the time working there, the higher up she got, to make sure that they could continue to trust her. So there is handwriting analysis. There's a lot of different things on handwriting that, like the FBI, for example, uses handwriting analysis, and it's just to understand people on a deep level to see what's there. But I take it a step further, and I'm studying the energy and the patterns and the lessons that are coming from every letter. Because the moment you're born, you're given a name, and that name has energy. There's a numerology with it. There's, for people who've studied, numerology, astrology, human design, all of that, there's an energy, a pattern, and a lesson that comes with that name. So I've studied famous people like Kobe Bryant, for example. You look at their signature, and then you look at the numerology behind it, you look at the way they signed it, you look at the letter patterns and energies that are there. And then it's no wonder certain personalities actually, are expressed through that energy. And through the letter patterns, and how they write it can tell where they're at on a growth path, and how much they have to work through, because the first letter of our first name is our biggest challenge in life. The first letter of our last name is our life path. And the reason why the first letter of our first name is our biggest challenge in life is because the capital letter works with the mindset. The other letters work with the everyday activities. And as soon as you're born, you start doing an energy exchange with your parents. And so you're taking on all of their struggles, so to speak, with the energy pattern and lesson of that individual letter of your first name. So then that becomes a cycle that we've got to work through and talk about on an individual basis, because everybody's, name is a little bit different.
Yeah, I know when I was in school, they taught me how to write the S, with the little curve, and I could never do that. And so I just make a line and then a little circle. When I do my S's, I don't go by what they taught me at all. So I don't know. So would it benefit somebody who's had maybe a hard life or has had difficulties and to change their name?
I have actually met with a couple of different people, and obviously through my experience from having a different last name, I had a personality shift. And so I can speak from my own experience. When a woman changes her last name and she gets a different last name, from that experience, you do have a personality shift. You do alter your ways of thinking, your ways of understanding, your ways of, different concepts that you relate with. You know yourself as this person, but when you change your name, it's your identity. So you're changing your identity, you're changing the way that you even relate with yourself. And, so I've got to be responsible with what I share, because I've shared with people, and there's a woman that I know that she changed her first name, middle name, and last name 3 different times within the course of her lifetime. And she just changed it a 3rd time a couple of years ago. And she said every single time it took about a year for her whole life to completely alter. In one name, she was super wealthy, but was dealing with abuse. The other name, she wasn't dealing with abuse, but, was struggling to make ends meet. With another name, she was, starting to experience things flowing again, but with a balance. And every single name had different energies, different patterns, and different lessons. And then I got to have that conversation with her about that. And I've seen people that they get married and they get that new last name and they skyrocket and they love it. There's other people that get married that get that new last name and they don't like it as much. So it's all a personal preference on what they like or don't like.
Right. So, well, the thing is, you want to make sure that you're not going to change your name to something that's going to be even more miserable, make you more miserable.
Right.
So you got to make sure that the energy to the new name is going to bring you something that you want.
Right.
And I find that interesting because, in the Bible, whenever someone started following God, he changed their name. He changed their, almost all these characters in the Bible, they started out with one name and he's like, all right, you know what? You're going to be called this now. You're going to be called this now. Women and men too. They just changed their names. So maybe that, it's in the Bible. So it's got to be true, right?
Yeah.
But,
Well, there's a lot of experiments that I've done to, try to test the energy of each letter and to really understand it on a deep level because of if I was going to go out and start teaching this and sharing it, I couldn't just take a guess at it. Like I had to know it on a personal level. Like, what does this one feel like? What does this one feel like? And obviously there's 26 letters in the alphabet. So it was quite a journey, but now I'm able to speak to somebody and say, this is what this is going to do. This is what this could do. I mean, it's not guaranteed, but I share with people, it's almost like wearing glasses. If you've got different color glasses, if you put red glasses on, all of a sudden you're going to see the world in red. If you've got blue glasses on, you're going to see the world in blue. If you've got purple glasses on, you're going to see the world in purple. It alters the way that you view the world. And when you start writing that new name or you start, changing the way that you write, you're going to alter that as well. So there's a lot to it for sure.
Yeah, that's great. I know I've talked to Chrissy, who's in the room, about this, and she's talked about changing her name. So I wanted to open it up. Was anybody here want to ask Misty a question?
Sally, before anybody hops on, I was just going to also the best-selling author of the book, You Can Heal Your Life with Handwriting. So if anybody, doesn't know or whatnot, you can get the book on Amazon. It was a bestseller last year, and it has my story and some tips in there.
Yeah. Actually, I have the book I bought it on the Kindle, so I have read it. So it is, I encourage everybody to go on to Amazon and check out her book. It's amazing. So was there anything else you wanted to talk to us about before we head out?
I'm to answer questions, and I do have a Facebook group if people are interested. I go live in that group quite often, a couple times a week for sure, that if people are looking for, more information, I've got a 5-day free masterclass that I did that's in the guide section and a lot more. So they could find it under Handwriting Soul Academy for the Facebook group. And I'm on all social media under Handwriting Soul Academy.
Lanny, did you have a question?
Yeah, are you talking about the way we write or the words we write?
So I'm talking about two different things that I really share and talk about is one, the way that you write is really important, the shape of each letter, the size, how you connect, why you connect, where to connect, all those different things is very important. But I also dive deeper into it based on everything that I've studied. And there's a pattern, energy, and lesson behind each individual letter in your name. I did my own experiment last year where I wrote my name for 30 days. I was going to write it for 30 days and I was going to write MISTI versus MISTY just to see if one letter, like how that one letter impacted me. And it was an experiment just so that I could have that education and that knowledge. And I had a very different experience with it, and it shifted the numerology as well as, you know, the letter pattern and the way things were showing up and coming in. And I was like, wow, you know, one letter makes a difference. So the way that you write it, how you write it, plus the letters, you know, the science of the energy patterns and lessons behind every individual letter plays a part in all of it.
So if you're writing real fast, to take notes, and then I can't read it when I look back at it. So, but that's, well, you're writing fast, you have no choice.
Right. Well, you want to go as slow as and format it as close as possible, because you're forming brain patterns when you do. So they say how you do one thing is how you do everything. And when you're able to pay attention and know and write it correctly. I mean, there's times when I write fast and I'm like, it's definitely not my best, but you know, at least it's in the ballpark, and it's not a home run by any means, but but yeah, that's.
Vivian has a question.
Go ahead, Vivian.
Hi. I saw, I'm like, oh, this is an interesting topic. Hi, I'm Vivian. And do some energy work and intuitive business healing as well. So I wanted to ask you, Misty, I was looking for the lady before that did this handwriting analysis thing, like what you're sharing today. So I'm glad you're here. My question is, do you notice any difference between people that are intuitive healers versus people that actually apply that in the business setting? Is there any difference, or even in specific letters, like, you know, I's or T's, how we do it, as we shift our focus on our, let's say, ideal market or ideal audience? Do you see any difference at all?
Yes, I do. A lot of people that I work with, depending on the letter of their name, they're working with that energy, and that energy, you know, plays out. But then it also depends on what their parents' names are, because there are certain letter traits that will be more intuitive than others. And based on their name, they're working with that energy. But then you've also got to look at the parents' names, because they took on a lot of the patterns and energies from the parents. So because of that, you're needing to look at a big picture, as well as siblings. I didn't have any siblings, but you know, my intuition shifted dramatically when I went from one last name to another last name. So every letter has, you know, a correlation to your intuition, and based on the way that you write it and all of those things. If you look at even your pets, you know, people have pets and they name their pets. Well, what did you name your pet? Everyone that I speak with, based on their pet names, they are picking up the energy, you know, and then they'll say, well, this pet's really like happy and you know, cuddly cuddly dog, versus this other dog is very like stuck up and stingy and only wants to be around, you know, certain people. And then I'm looking at them, plus the dog names and the pet names, like all of it matters. I never realized how deep this went when I started studying it. And the more that I study, the more people that I talk with, the more that I connect with others, the more I'm looking at patterns. I'm looking at, you know, how things are playing out. And I just have a natural instinct for it because of my experience, that I'm, you know, always gathering data, you know, for the last 10 years, and have put a lot of different concepts together. And, you know, it really does come down to everything matters, you know, all of it matters. The state that you live in, the address that you have, the city that you live in. I traveled in an RV across the country last year, and I didn't know this then, but because I was traveling, I was paying attention. I was like, why does Colorado feel so different than New Mexico? Feels so different than Utah? Feels so different than Texas? And then I really got the concept that we're working with the energy of those states, you know, and then the city. I mean, it goes deep.
Yeah. I guess, and another question is, is the numerology you studied based on like Western numerology or Chaldean numerology? Because I was familiar with both, and they said that there's a little bit of a difference in the concept. So just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, I would actually love to speak with a numerologist, and I haven't yet to get kind of more of the expert advice, because I'm not an expert in numerology at all, but I have studied it enough to know that every name has a numerology, and then you start playing with it and you're like, oh wow, this is different than that. And then you're like, I want to speak to an expert, you know? I'm definitely not an expert in that field, but I have seen it, and I have dabbled in it enough to say that there's something there, and it definitely has an impact, but I don't know it enough to, you know, not the way that I know the letters.
One last question, Sally, is this okay? I'm asking.
Yeah, no, keep go.
So as far, yeah, I understand that name part, because I remember, so I dabble a lot in energy. So I had a numerologist. She was Chaldean, right? That's what she teaches. And I dabbled a lot into the energy world, and then eventually started teaching it. When the name wise, right? So I remember the lady, when I told her my full name, in addition to my husband's last name, this is the first thing she said, right? Like, oh my God, you're like a doormat. Like, that's what she said initially, right? And then I'm like, what? What's the doormat? How is that possible, right? And it's so interesting when I shifted it to my birth name, you know, what's on your birth certificate. Because the way she said it, it's like, if you were born riding a white horse and then you decided to get married, and then you jump into another horse, she said, because your name changed. I go, oh, no wonder why my life has changed about a lot of things, money, health, like a lot, right? And relationship, those are the main areas. And so when I went back to the maiden name, it's so interesting because, of course, you know how people talk. Wow, did you guys get divorced? I'm like, no, I'm just using a different name. But it takes a while, right? Like I heard from before, like it takes 7 years to even change energy to that. I'm like, what's your concept on that? Yeah.
My personal experience, I can speak from my personal experience, because I was Misty Cogdill up until I was 22. And then I got married and had that last name for 6 years, and then got divorced, got my maiden name back. And it took time. And I would say within the course of 1 year, I noticed a major difference going from, you know, my maiden name to my married name, and then what that was all about. And then going from my married name back to my maiden name, all the changes that took place there. There were job changes, you know, so I talk a lot with women, and I'm like, you know, what happened within the first year of marriage? Did you change jobs? Did you move? Did you have a baby? Like, usually there's some big event, because that last name is no longer a match for the new last name. And so from my personal experience, there was a job change both times. And from that, I was sitting back and just kind of recognizing, you know, it's like layers.
Yep.
Right? Like you have layers, subconscious layers. And the first year I went through a lot of subconscious layers and got to be myself again. But then over the next 6 years, I was still working through the patterns from when I had a different last name. So yep. I sometimes feel like, and this isn't, you know, a fact or whatnot, but just from my own experience, it seemed like for the length of time that I had a different last name, it took about that long to get back again. So not that it's 7 years or whatever, but if you're married for 3 years or 15 years, you know, you're working through those layers constantly, and we're always ever evolving. But this is a good fundamental that they don't talk about anywhere. You know, I'm like, someone's got to stand up and talk about this. Like, there's somebody to say, hey, I've had this experience. I can share from my experience on what you might experience and how you may feel with it.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. There are changes in those patterns. And even in our evolution, right, with whatever name we assume now, there's still changes with the changes in the planet. And I'm like, oh my God, I guess that's the only thing constant in this world is change. So might as well be good at it and just ride the wave, so to speak, right? We're still experiencing it now.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I seen a post the other day, and this woman's getting ready to get married, and she did a comment and a post, and she goes, I'm really sad to give up my last name. And she goes, has any other woman felt like this? And then I commented right away. I'm like, yes, I wrote a book on it. And I was like, went into all the description, and I'm like, it's not talked about enough. And there's not enough, people just think, oh, well, you just change, and they don't think that there's actually something there. And then that was my case. Like, I didn't know that changing
I didn't know any different. Yeah.
Was going to have that big of an impact on me, and that I was going to use it for the rest of my life to try to educate women like, hey, this matters. This is important. Pay attention.
Actually, I heard that the Chinese women do not change their last names. When they get married, they don't. Certain cultures don't. And so they preserve somehow family names for them are super important. And so they value that and whatever came down with that lineage. So they don't change last names. They just stay as they are. So I was wondering when it started that all these things, marriage certificate has to change. But yeah, I agree. Like I guess we learn from all that, right? That's the key.
We do. And it is a little bit of a hassle because, you have your social security card, you got to change your driver's license. There's so much to change when you change your name. But when you do change your name, I think what happened in culture and society is like, well, if everyone has the same last name, that they're all a family. Like, last name you're going to give the children, the mom or the dad. And if the mom, if the dad is going to have the children are going to have the dad's last name, then what about the mom? Like, why not just make them all the same so you know that they're all one family and that they're all together? And It does have an impact. It does make a difference. But I've talked with men, over the years, and, this isn't just a female thing, because the guy is like, hey, I proposed to this woman, and this woman, after we got married, is not the same woman that I proposed to. It's like, well, yeah, because she took on your last name and all of your stuff that came with it. So
not just his stuff, but all the family stuff.
Right? Exactly. You take on the all the family patterns and all that goes with that. So there's, it's so fascinating. It really
is. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for all your great questions.
Anyone else have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Lily.
I do agree that when you get married, you kind of lose your identity, because all you're left with is your first name. And what do you consider on the nicknames versus given names? Because I go by my nickname.
Yeah, I've studied that and have met several women over people, men and women both, who have nicknames, and it depends on what you write, because you're accessing the energy when you write. It's almost like you're energetically drawing things to you. And so if you're writing your nickname as opposed to your maiden name, you're activating the letters in that nickname as opposed to the maiden or the birth name that you're given. So the nickname versus the real name, it depends on what you write. There's, for example, my mom's name is Teresa. There's some people that are named Teresa and they go by Terry, or, they write the name Terry. Well, if they write the name Terry, they're not writing the letters. So they're not accessing the energy from the name Teresa versus Terry. And a lot of people think my name is Melissa and that I go by Misty as my nickname. And I'm like, no, that's the name I was given at birth. And then they're like, oh, okay. But if I was to write a different name, I would access that different energy. So when you write it, it activates it. It's kind of like turning the light switch on and off. You're turning the light switch on. So it definitely plays out and definitely has an impact.
So is that a negative if you're writing your nickname? Particularly?
That is all personal preference. I don't tell anyone whether it's right or wrong. It's no different than, if I was to ask you chocolate or vanilla, choose. Well, you prefer chocolate over vanilla. Well, I prefer vanilla over chocolate. So it's really personal preference of what you like and how you like it. And if you're like, you know what, I just don't resonate. I've met some people and they only go by their nickname. And there's one gal whose name was Danielle and she goes by Danny. And it was like, she goes, I don't relate with Danielle at all. She goes, I write it and it's weird, but I write Danny. And I was like, well, that's a different numerology. It's got, a little bit different of letters. And so that individual it's their identity, right? So how do you relate with yourself with your identity? And that becomes your connection point. That becomes how you know yourself. But I've met women who've completely changed their last name. And there's even a lady that I've studied who's her name is Amanda Francis, and she changed her last name, right? And so I've looked up on that, and she just decided to randomly pick a new last name, and she didn't continue on with her family last name, and she didn't get married. But she completely got to shift all kinds of things because of the identity and the letter energy patterns that are there. She got to access new energy. So it really goes deep, and there's so much more to this than I even realized. And I've been studying this for 10 years and I'm still learning. Like every day you meet someone new. There was a woman that I met in real estate, and her husband and her were married for 40 years. And when they both signed the purchase agreement, she signed a different last name than he did. And so, of course, what I was studying passionately as a hobby, I asked him about that. And she said, oh, yeah, after 17 years of marriage, I decided to take my maiden name back. And she says, we were going to get a divorce, but instead I just took my maiden name back. And then we stayed married, and we've been happily married ever since. And she says that it just didn't feel like myself. And when I got my maiden name back, I felt like myself again. And I, had that conversation, and I said, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, and, can speak from experience with it. But this happens to everybody, every woman out there. If you change your name, if you're paying attention, you'll recognize it. But the fact that it takes a year, and then usually you have a job change, and then or a baby comes in, or you move or something, then you relate all those changes that shifted within the neurological patterns of the brain. You connect that change to the job, or to the baby, or to the move, or to whatever. You don't connect it back to, well, I got married. But it's the moment you get married, we don't change the next day. Otherwise, everybody would have figured this out centuries ago.
So do you have something that somebody can look at and say, okay, you know what, I want to change my name. What are good letters that should be in my name? If I want to have a new job, should I have my name have an S in it? Should it have a B in it? Is there certain letters that do certain things for us?
Well, every letter has a pattern, and I talk with everybody in my course about the patterns, and then that becomes personal preference. If you're like, I really want to work with this letter, and this letter because I really like those patterns, then you're going to personally choose that. I can't choose that for you, or I can't tell you, I think you need this letter because, you're like, well, I really don't like that one, but I really like this one. There's some people that I've met, and then they fall in love with one letter energy, and then another one, they're like, not so much. Whereas that one, it was like, oh, I really love that one. And then somebody else might not. So it really does come down to personal preference, and there's no right or wrong, good or bad. I just share with you what's there. I'm just a guide, and I share all what's there. And then I'm like, well, here's my personal experience with this, and this, and here's what played out, and here's the cause and effect, and here's all of, my opinions and my thoughts on all these different experiments that I've done. Now you get to decide, what do you want to do with that? And then and then there's different things that I can do to have them decide what's best for them. But I mean, I've been studying it for 10 years, and I've had the thought of changing my name, and I was like, like I could change my name, and what would I change it to? And I'm like, I've done so much work under Misty Cogdill, and I'm like, to try and get a new last name or a new name and then have to work with all that new energy, which I know what the energies are, but then to have to relate to myself newly and like all the things, I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready for that, or if I mean, who knows what'll happen. But I do know when I get married again someday that I'm going to hyphenate, and I will keep Cogdill, and I'll hyphenate and add the guy's last name onto Cogdill, as opposed to replacing it, taking away or adding to. I do share with women that, you can just add to who you are instead of take away and replace.
Right. Or use your name as your middle name. You can.
Well, even your middle name has an energy. If people write their middle name, that's bringing a part of your personality in too. I write my middle name all the time. So if I got rid of that, there would be a missing, because I've connected with it for the last 10 years.
Really, I don't write my middle name at all on anything.
Yeah.
Could it be that when you get married, it's maybe not just the name change, but the relationship that you develop with your husband, negative or positive, that is making you feel like you changed or you're not yourself anymore?
Well, there's a lot of men that they recognize that the woman that they propose to is not the same person, once they've been married for a little while. And it's like, well, because you have a different last name. If you took on that different last name, you're taking on different patterns, different energies, different lessons. And there's going to be a cause and effect and an impact of that. And if the guy's paying attention, he's going to notice and know that, hey, she's not the same woman anymore. And there's a reason behind that. And I can sit back and I can coach couples and share with them exactly what plays out and exactly what's going on, so that they can work on that instead of getting divorced. It's like, well, here, let's try a couple of these other things before, you decide to, untie the knot, and kind of talk with them about different options and what that would look like for them.
But sometimes too, the name change can be a positive thing.
Right, exactly. And that's,
when I changed mine, I actually, my husband's, and what I've done with my husband's last name is a lot more than I think I would have done with my maiden name, because that was, I had negative feelings towards that, where now this is more positive. So it could go, it's not always, oh, I took his name, it's a negative thing. It could be a positive thing too, in a positive shift, in a positive change.
And I don't want anyone to think that it's a negative. My experience was not one that I, wanted to keep, or from my experience, I had lost a lot of my identity from Cogdill, and getting it back, there was a major difference. There was a major impact. There was a big influential difference of my being and how I relate to myself, how I know myself. And so I was happy to go back to Cogdill, because that's how I knew myself. And I really like the energy and the patterns and the lessons. But everybody, there are women that I've met that all of a sudden, things got really, really good. There was a lady in the Bob Proctor program that I was a part of as a Bob Proctor coach. And she was, she had one last name and wasn't doing very, very well. And then she got married, got a different last name, and all of a sudden skyrocketed and became one of his #1 consultants. And Bob's sitting back going, oh yeah, that's awesome. Good for you. You're applying the work. And I'm sitting back going, she changed her name, which is giving her different results.
Yeah, I love that.
So, but if you don't know what you don't know, then you're going to associate it with something else, as opposed to what the facts and the fundamentals are. So,
That's
yeah,
great.
there's so much to this. I've sat down and talked to people for hours about it because there's one lady that I worked with in my program, and she ended up losing all kinds of weight from it. You know, she was taking the course, and she goes, "Is it normal to lose weight?" And I said, "Well, based on the letters that you're working with," I said, "that tends to be common because you're paying attention differently, your focus and concentration and all of that." And she ended up losing like 20 pounds within, the first couple of months. And she's like, "This is awesome." And so I said, "Well, I've even thought maybe I could have a health class on it too, and share with people on that as well." But yeah, I've seen people's relationships improve. I've seen people's self-esteem, their self-confidence, their self-image, because this is such a deep correlation with who we are. Your self-image of how you view yourself does shift. It does change. And how you see yourself will improve because of it and as a result. But there's layers of stuff that might be in the way that need to be cleared out. And when you're shifting your handwriting, all of a sudden that stuff that's unsolved comes bubbling up to the surface because it's no longer held down from the old handwriting and the old way of thinking. It's almost like you're carving out new patterns, new trails in a forest. And then those new trails, all of a sudden you're over here, and all this stuff that's buried starts to come up. And then it's like, "Hey, we're unsolved here. You need to get us complete. You need to work through this. You need to heal this. Let's resolve it." And then you got to work through that stuff. Once you get it cleared and complete, it's like you're fresh and new, and you've got a blank canvas to say, "Well, what do you want to draw on the paper? Let's draw your new life." There's a lot that gets cleared because of shifting it. So I work with people as they shift. That's one of the things that I'm coaching them on with the weekly group coaching that I have, is all that stuff when it's coming up. How do you deal with it? How do you process it? I had a lady just the other day that I recommended she stop because she had so much trauma from her past that I said, "I don't think this is a good idea anymore, because you've got too much trauma to deal with. You're going to have to go a lot slower in the program, or stop for a while, get yourself stable." And once you get yourself stable and are strong within, then we can try this again. But if you're not feeling strong and stable within, I don't want you taking my program, because it's going to create a mess.
Yeah. So Misty, why don't you tell everyone how people can get a hold of you? Share again about your book, where they can get your book, and your Facebook groups, and so.
All the things. Yeah, thank you. So my company is Handwriting Soul Academy. I'm on Facebook as Misty Cogdill, and my handwriting group, the group that I have where I go live a couple times a week, is called Handwriting Soul Academy. So you can look that up on Facebook. I'm also on Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube as Handwriting Soul Academy. There's lots of testimonials on YouTube, as well as in the group that you can see. My book is You Can Heal Your Life with Handwriting, and it was an Amazon bestseller last year, so you can look it up on Amazon. And all of the things, I have a couple different programs that I offer, from a 1-hour reading to a 90-day course to a 6-month course. So it all depends on what a person wants to tackle and all the things that go with it. So. But thank you, Sally, for having me.
Thank you for coming. This has been so much fun. Does anyone else have any last questions before we say goodbye? Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Misty, for being my guest, and we will see you next